Hello, this is a Brighter Futures film about how ideas improve lives and change policy. It's a great pleasure to welcome Liam Jarvis of the Department of Literature, Film and Theatre Studies today. Great pleasure. Your expertise, Liam, is in contemporary performance and practice in digital and immersive environments. So could you tell us a bit about what you do research on and how that also influences educational practice?
Thanks, Jules. So I've always been really interested in the way in which digital cultures have changed the way theatre, I think, is a constantly evolving practice, which fascinates me. Often when people think of theatre, we get the clip art version of sort of the red velvet seats, all of these kinds of fairly traditional conservative ideas about what an act of theatre might be. But of course, many people might think, well, the theatre is not for them. And I think the theatre is really, at its heart, a place of gathering. It's a place to come and confront who we think we are currently and who we imagine we might be in the future, and what the world is that we want to live in, often by putting fictionalized worlds onto the stage, or even aspects of our real world onto the stage. Digital is a whole new set of tools, I suppose, with which to reach people. I think that the theatre has been a very interesting cultural practice coming off the back of the pandemic. Theatre continues to struggle, I think, and there's lots of evidence to suggest that 20% of the audience still haven't quite come back to the theatre buildings yet. So there's some urgency in thinking about how theatre meets its audience. What's changed post-pandemic in behaviours and attitudes towards theatre making? What's the responsibility of venues and artists to find those audiences in the places where we might find them if it's not in the theatre? And how also might we attract those audiences back to these really important communal, in-the-room convivial spaces where we can come and be challenged and test ourselves and be creative and be inspired by the things we're seeing on the stage. So a lot of the things I found myself exploring in my research look, on the surface of it, not necessarily a lot like what you might consider theatre to be. So using headphones to send people on guided tours of locations and being involved with placemaking, or creating online experiences for audiences, but again as a place of gathering, or sending virtual reality headsets around the globe for us to share and watch a production together when the theatres are in lockdown and we no longer have access to them. So I think the pandemic has certainly sent shockwaves through the discipline. I think it's also, to some extent, gives us a chance to reimagine and think about what inter-pandemic theatre looks like. And a lot of my research has been about thinking about pandemic research into theatre practice. So that's a big part of my process. I
like this idea of this kind of convivial, thinking of this as a communal thing. It's not just some people watching some other people and then they both go away at the end of it. You want some magic to happen in the middle of that space. And the construction of that space is not just a physical one, which is where we imagined it in the first place.
Yes, it's a construction of a politics, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that fascinated me about the pandemic was this idea, I suppose, of the resilience we're all told that we should have, which is, of course, a really complicated idea, and there are many different versions and ideas, competing ideas around resilience. The more problematic ideas, I think, are the ones where we're told to be independently resilient. And I think what the pandemic showed us was that none of us are independently resilient, that actually we're very, very interdependent. And I suppose the theatre is a site to think that through. What kind of resilience do we want? And also, are we giving people the necessary tools and skills? And one of the problems, so I'm just about to release a new book called Post-Digital Performances of Care, Technology and Pandemic. And we're quite critical of this notion of individualized ideas of resilience. And the opening provocation of that book is by a theatre company called Prototype. And they talk about the idea there was this issue in the pandemic where theatre companies were suddenly being called upon to immediately have a known set of expertise around digital practice to be able to access audiences that were now completely inaccessible to them. The assumption was that these skills would be ready-made. They'd already be, you switch them on. Yeah. And also, and even perhaps more troubling than that, some theatre companies were being looked upon as social service providers. So cracks that were appearing, who had theatre companies acting as food banks, who had as self-referred food banks. And also you had theatre buildings becoming Nightingale courtrooms, so that suddenly the theatre spaces, these sort of utopian idea of safe spaces, which of course is a problematic idea, but suddenly became punitive spaces and spaces of judgment. So what does it mean when you coalesce the idea of a building that's intended for theatre to be a place of legal judgment as well? So all of these interesting conflations and trying to unpick and deconstruct what those mean in order to reimagine the next steps of theatre's evolution and to engage the public and also to engage students in that process of what do we want this to be? And I think because it's one of the most culturally vulnerable practices mid-pandemic, it also is raising fundamental questions about what we value. So that's one of the things I'm really interested in exploring through this book.
So you were awarded the best, most innovative teacher of the year in 2021 in the UK, in the university sector in the broadest sense. So part of your interest is in how you translate these ideas into an educational context as well, and getting new generations of people to understand this broader concept of theatre as you've been talking about. Tell us a bit about that.
Something quite complex about the idea of awards that do pluck individuals.
Well, exactly. It speaks against just what you've been saying.
And actually, so much of the experience of teaching in theatre is about collaboration with one's colleagues and collaboration with students and co-conspiring, co-conceiving of ideas of theatre, and again, sort of using the hive mind of the room to try and work out the direction that theatre is going to go in. I sit on the board of a theatre company called Theatre Rights, who make work for young audiences and children. And that board has taught me a lot, actually, that I take into my classrooms and about who gets excluded from certain conceptions and ideas of theatre, and what might it look like to make a theatre that might not be for children, but doesn't exclude children from that process. So thinking a lot from the beginning about who the audience is for anything, who do we want to reach and how do we know we're going to find them? How do we begin to reach them? That's where digital thinking comes into the discussion, because digital provides an access maybe to other kinds of audiences. Maybe also it discludes certain audiences from access as well. So I think there are maybe intergenerational disparities around the digital. I was really interested in the coining of the pandemic as a digital pandemic. I thought, digital pandemic, is that what it was? It certainly wasn't the first post-internet pandemic, but it certainly was the first pandemic that drove theatre makers and audiences online, at a scale never seen before. So this mass upheaval, and then thinking, well, how do we want the digital to fit into that? Where should it fit into that? Where do we want hybridity? Where is, I think the other really interesting thing is there's theatre companies that are making work, the kinds of work that's critical of, for example, surveillance on public citizens. And ironically, that kind of work can't be made and circulated digitally because there are laws and notices and policies that prevent those sorts of discussions from taking place in the digital sphere. So we think, okay, so maybe maybe we need to go back into the shared in the room space in order to have those kinds of conversations about power and about surveillance and about digital technology. So it's interesting to think about. We need a sort of culture that creates space for all of these different things, I think.
You talked a bit about the kind of journey that theatre in all of these guises opens up a greater understanding about the journey of life. We don't want to be too grandiose about it, but the things that we go through in life, the rites and passages and changes and the gates that block us and can be opened up. So a key part of what you work on is on immersion and experience, this whole thing of immersion. Tell us a bit about how that works, how it helps, for example, young people navigate through life, perhaps a more complex and worrisome world ahead of them at the moment.
I'm fascinated in ideas around immersion. There's lots of different conceptions and ideas around what counts as immersive practice as well. One practice I've written about in my past research and that interests me is a kind of immersion associated with digital technologies that might be termed as virtual embodiment. So the idea of taking up the position of other kinds of bodies, using things like virtual reality tools or first-person media. This creates all sorts of complexities about what does it mean to be a tourist, inside someone else's body, maybe for half an hour, to then step outside. Is that, what are the problems around that? But also, what are the possibilities? What kind of conversations might it enable to have been virtually another body for 15 minutes? So we've been seeing these sorts of tools being used in all sorts of interesting areas, from things ranging from conflict resolution, so what might it mean to step into the virtual body of someone who is my enemy, to understand an argument from their perspective. And of course, in storytelling and in theatre, often we're trying to walk into the shoes and find ways of creating radical acts of empathy with a broad cross-section of different people who represent, the public.
The best forms of storytelling do that anyway, don't they?
They do.
Allow you invite you in to the shoes of other people to understand how they see the world. And one would hope that as a result of that, you have a greater understanding of the complexities and the empathies that are required.
Absolutely. There's something I think that I love about theatre. There's a sort of humbleness for me that comes with an act of creating theatre, because when a new set of students, for example, join us at the beginning of the year, I have absolutely no idea who I'm working with. I have no idea quite what their expectations are. I don't quite know what they've been taught in terms of what they imagine theatre is, what it does in the world, and what it can do, and what they want to explore. So there's a renewal, of course, that comes with every intake, every year, where I'm constantly being challenged about my own preconceptions about what an act of theatre might become. And of course, the experiences that exist before they're arriving at a course are important and are part of what we want to explore and kind of make public, I suppose. So it's about providing people with the skills to be able to communicate some pre-existing lived experiences, as well as to test these ideas about what theatre can be, and to expand the creative possibilities, I suppose, by exposing students to international and global practices that maybe they haven't encountered up until this point. So I think that thing about trying to really stretch the discipline, but also as teachers to be constantly stretched. You never quite feel like the expert in a rehearsal room, but there's always somebody in the room that is. So you can always call upon the expertise, and it might not be the director that has the expertise. So the de-hierarchizing of education within the context of something that looks like a rehearsal room. And of course, rehearsal rooms are not always de-hierarchized.
Oh, well, no, exactly.
Rehearsal rooms can absolutely be the opposite of that. But I suppose at their best, I think they can be these places to foster collaborations. And of course, theatre is rarely about itself. We're constantly looking outwards. So the possibilities, one of the joys, I think, of working at Essex has been the possibility of cross-disciplinary discussion. And the digital opens up a whole world into other sets of skills and expertise. So that's something that really excites me.
Do you think in this kind of flattening that you've described, of kind of evening up of relationships, power a little bit for some of the time, at least, and the greater public engagement, we've also heard in theatre of greater kind of anxiety and concern about audiences and their kind of responsibilities. Sometimes assumptions are that they should be quiet, do nothing, take no pictures, and you hear all sorts of kind of stories which are forms of engagement, but also kind of transgress existing rules. It seems as though that's a complex space, and I'm not sure the stories that you hear about actors telling people to be quiet and listen to them actually plays out really well.
One interesting thing I spotted on social media recently was a call from a very well-known actor to introduce technologies that cut out signal to people's mobile phones. I don't know if you encountered that, which is actually against the law. You actually can't block people's signals. But that's very interesting, and that kind of got me questioning. That's a really interesting provocation, again, about what do we want our theatres to be doing? Do we want our theatres to be an authoritarian space that kind of govern the way that our audiences behave, or actually are we starting to verge towards something that looks slightly authoritarian by doing that? Children's theatre is very instructive in this sense, because there can be no assumption that your audience know anything about the rules of the game in terms of how to behave in a theatre building. So actually, theatre companies at their best that make work for younger audiences are well attuned to this. And I think actually we could maybe be turning to some of these companies and asking. And I think there's also something, maybe an unfair expectation on audiences, having had so long barred from access to these public spaces that are their spaces, to immediately come back and know, how one should behave. No, you can't do this. I think actually we're all on a process of relearning, and I think it's my tendency is to is to not be too punitive in the way that we kind of govern audiences, but maybe ask audiences, get an opportunity to hit the refresh button on the conversation of how one should act in these spaces. There are also plenty of participatory forms of theatre throughout history that have opened up, tried to, in a weird way, it's at odds with the whole architecture and design of the way that many theatres are organised, where there's a clear division between spectators and actors. And actually, a lot of participatory works try their utmost to erase those clear distinctions and boundaries, to say that actually the theatre is all of us, and at any point I might, as in this conversation, there's times when I'm audience to the questions and times when I'm active participant in maybe answering things. So from day to day, we're all actors and audiences at various points throughout our days. So it's thinking again about how we can rethink the theatre in light of coming back and having to relearn the rules, I think.
A couple of big headlines of recommendations or big ideas or suggestions that come out of your work on broadening this idea of theatre and performance, of immersion, of engagement of public in different sorts of ways. What kind of comes to the top of your mind? I mean, your book's about kind of care as well, so it's kind of moving this into new social spaces. Is that part of the territory?
I think care is absolutely at the heart of the conversation at the moment, in terms of how we care for one another, how we care for audiences. So many assumptions I think we've had before about what counts as a safe space have been called into question over the last 10 years, and especially as a result of the pandemic. How do we create how do we form a contract together about what acceptable learning and conditions are, I suppose, within our class spaces and within our theatres? And I think it's heightening the need to have conversations, I think, with the audiences amongst other companies as well, shared conversations about what does caring for an audience look like? How can that not be an overly paternalistic act, but also how can we recognise the highly divergent needs? I think we're faced at the moment, in a sense, in the pandemic, because we were largely wearing surgical masks, the crisis was highly visible in a way that now we're still by no means out of the crisis, but there's, I suppose, more invisibility. But of course, I've encountered, even over the last year, real issues that people are facing, as I'm sure we all have, around care. People have been thrust into the role of caring responsibilities as a result of the pandemic, the cost of living crisis, of course, global conflict, all of these multiple manifold crises. So I think at the heart of the conversation at the moment is just how do we create the requisite space that we need in order to create the kind of art that needs to exist in the world? What are audiences ready for? Is this a time to challenge on certain fronts? Is this a time actually to give the audience some respite from some of those challenges? And also, what kind of theatre do emergent practitioners feel? The answer's in their hands as well. I keep telling my students that, you're the theatre maker, you're the next generation of theatre makers. You tell me, what theatre should be doing right now. What do you think in your context? The theatre, how should we be adjusting? So I think care is absolutely at the heart of that. So I've been going back to care theory from the feminists of the 1980s to think, okay, how do we update some of these really valuable concepts in the light of digital, for example, or in light of, because care, I suppose, is often theorised as a interrelational act between people face to face. But then when you enter the digital sphere, what then does that look like when there's added anonymity? I think there's something about the experience of living on Zoom, for example, where you can mute somebody or you can resign them to a waiting room. And these are things that are unimaginable in the real world. Yeah. So what does that actually mean? How does that affect the way, also in our real world relations, what's the feedback loop between that sort of engagement and the shift in how we relate in our everyday spaces? So I think there's, I think essential to the conversation at the moment is care.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much indeed. Well, Liam Jarvis, been a pleasure having you on. Thanks very much indeed. For more conversations about how ideas improve lives, pop along to our sister podcast, Louder Than Words.